VAR, hit or miss?
VAR has become a nightmare in modern football. Not overnight, not in one season, but year after year, match after match, controversy after controversy.
The protocol was followed correctly. It's the wrong decision, we all know. It is the wrong decision, and everybody
well, what's the point in having it then? If it's the wrong decision.
January 2026, Craven Cottage. Florian Wirtz scores for Liverpool. Millions watching at home instinctively think the same thing. Offside. The lines come up. The check is completed. The goal stands. Confusion spreads faster than celebration.
When I initially saw this, I straight away thought Wirtz is offside. Well, now I know that there's an allowance of 5 centimeters, and that's the reason why it's given onside.
The argument isn't even about the finish anymore. It's about pixels, margins, and how absurdly precise football has allowed itself to become. October 2023, 2 seasons earlier, Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. Luis Diaz scores a perfectly valid goal. The flag stays down. VAR checks, and a communication error inside the booth means the goal is wrongly disallowed.
All of a sudden, like, check complete. Like, what? No lines. It was so quick. It was too quick, and something was obviously wrong.
The mistake is admitted days later. Audio is released. Apologies are made. The points are gone. February 2023. The Emirates. Arsenal concede a late equalizer against Brentford. VAR fails to fully check the offside in the build-up. Days later, the league confirms a significant error. The title race has already moved on. Fast forward again. 2025-26 season. Stamford Bridge. Fulham have a goal incorrectly ruled out after a VAR review. Molineux. Wolves are denied a penalty while chasing a comeback. Brentford. A last man foul produces a yellow instead of a red. Newcastle. A late challenge on Phil Foden inside the box goes unpunished. Different stadiums, different seasons, the same bloody argument. Now the numbers are catching up with the feeling. This 2025-26 Premier League season, data reviewed by the league's own key match incidents panel shows VAR errors have risen by 30%, increasing from 10 to 13 compared to last year. More revealing still, the majority are missed interventions. Moments VAR reviewed but chose not to change. At the same time, total VAR overturns have fallen by nearly 18%. More checks, fewer corrections. VAR was introduced in 2019 to eliminate football's biggest injustices, to correct the obvious, to protect results from human error. Yet 6 years on, controversy hasn't disappeared. It's evolved. It's become quieter, more technical, and harder to explain. This isn't about one club. It isn't about one referee. And it isn't just about this season. This is the real story of VAR and how its decisions are changing football.
I have to say, I really don't like VAR very much anymore. I was one of those that advocated it, and I actually feel quite guilty, and I was definitely wrong. It's spoiling the game.
Before VAR, football lived in what referees quietly called the crisis era. Decisive mistakes were no longer occasional controversies. They were global moments. Goals decided titles, relegations, and international qualification, only to be replayed endlessly on television from angles the referee could never see in real time. From Thierry Henry's handball against Ireland in 2009 to marginal offside calls that altered Champions League ties, football reached a breaking point where human limitation was being exposed by broadcast technology. Referees were being judged not against the speed of the game, but against slow motion and multiple camera angles. The gap between what officials could see and what fans could replay had become unsustainable. That's the context in which VAR was born. After years of trials led by the Dutch FA, the system was formally written into the laws of the game in March 2018. The philosophy was explicit and carefully worded: minimal interference, maximum benefit. VAR was never designed to re-referee matches. Its purpose was narrower, to reduce decisive errors, not eliminate all disagreement. When Premier League clubs voted unanimously in November 2018 to introduce VAR for the 2019-20 season, the promise was simple: correct goals that should not stand, award penalties that were clearly missed, identify red card offenses referees couldn't see, prevent cases of mistaken identity, nothing more, nothing less. That limitation was deliberate. VAR was restricted to 4 match-changing situations: goals, penalties, direct red cards, and mistaken identity. Even within those categories, VAR was instructed to act only when an error was clear and obvious. Subjective judgment was still to belong to the referee on the pitch. This is where the tension began. Football had become faster than human perception. Referees were asked to judge offside lines at full sprint, distinguish accidental contact from deliberate fouls in crowded penalty areas, and assess red card challenges from a single live angle, all in real time, under pressure, with no margin for correction. When those calls were wrong, they were final. A missed offside could swing a title race. A handball unseen in a packed box could decide Champions League qualification. This wasn't a failure of referees as individuals. It was a structural problem. The modern game was producing more decisive moments than the officiating model could reliably handle. That reality forced football to change. The solution was conceived as a restraint, not a takeover, a safety net to step in only when the consequences were too big to ignore. Here's where it gets complicated. In the Premier League, the referee's original decision is protected. VAR only intervenes if that call is judged to be a clear and obvious error. That distinction changes everything. VAR isn't tasked with finding the best possible decision. It's tasked with identifying decisions that are wrong enough to justify interference. Once that standard is applied, vast areas of football fall into ambiguity. A challenge may be late, but is it careless or reckless? Contact may occur, but is it sufficient for a penalty? An attacker may be fouled, but was a goal-scoring opportunity truly denied? These aren't technical questions, they're interpretive ones, and the Premier League has deliberately chosen to protect interpretation in order to preserve match flow and referee authority. Even at its most advanced, VAR operates with built-in restrictions. First, not all incidents are reviewable. If an action falls outside the 4 defined categories, VAR cannot intervene, regardless of how obvious it appears to viewers. Second, VAR doesn't make final decisions on subjective calls. It can recommend an on-field review, but the referee retains ultimate authority and can reject that advice. VAR can advise. VR can recommend. VR can even prove something factually wrong, but VR cannot overrule authority. That design choice was meant to protect referees. In practice, it would define nearly every controversy that followed. That was the blueprint. What follows is not a story of VAR failing to do its job, but of what happens when a system built for restraint is applied to a sport that increasingly demands certainty. And that tension defines everything fans experience today. Across its first season, VAR checks ran into the thousands, and the Premier League recorded 109 overturned decisions in 2019-20, a headline figure that signaled just how often match-changing calls were being corrected. But what supporters learned almost instantly is that VAR doesn't remove controversy, it reorganizes it. The first season quickly produced a defining feeling. The technology was powerful, but the interpretation still belonged to humans. One early flashpoint that shaped public trust came in Manchester City versus Tottenham on August 17th, 2019. City thought they'd won it late. VAR ruled the goal out for handball, and the stadium mood flipped in seconds. It wasn't just the decision, it was the emotional whiplash, and the sense that football now lived under forensic replay. That year set the template. VAR would intervene often. The game would still feel subjective. Fans would start arguing about process, not only decisions. By 2020-21, VAR had become less of a novelty and more of a weekly ritual, but instead of calming the noise, a different controversy took over: offside lines and microscopic margins. This is where the public relationship with VAR changed. People stopped debating what happened and started debating how the system measures what happened. And the league's own intervention totals remained high across the early VAR years. The footprint was undeniable. The key issue wasn't simply accuracy, it was relatability. When a decision gets decided by millimeters and camera angles, fans don't feel reassured, they feel policed. If 2019-20 introduced VAR and 2020-21 normalized it, 2021-22 is where trust took a serious hit, because some of the biggest incidents weren't about tight offsides anymore. They were about obvious match-shaping moments that still ended in controversy. A defining example, Everton versus Manchester City in February 2022, when Rodri's handball became one of the season's most debated non-interventions. Everton wanted a penalty. City escaped it. And once again, the argument wasn't VAR didn't see it. It was, how can that be seen and still not corrected? This season sharpened a brutal reality. VAR could slow the game down. VAR could examine everything, and yet the threshold could still block intervention. This is a major turning point because 2022-23 is when the Premier League's key match incidents panel framework starts. To to define public conversation, not just controversy, but officially logged VAR errors. And the numbers were heavy. Across 2022-23, the KMI panel ultimately recorded 38 VAR errors, the highest figure in the multi-season comparison. The season's signature disaster was Arsenal versus Brentford in February 2023. The Ivan Toney goal that stood after a VAR offside error, later acknowledged as a major mistake. It didn't just affect points, it affected belief in the system's competence. So by the end of 2022-23, VAR wasn't simply unpopular, it was being documented as fallible at scale. Here's where it gets interesting. The timeline shows the league trying to improve, while the public experience still feels chaotic. In 2023-24, the KMI panel recorded 31 VAR errors, down from 38, meaning the system improved statistically. But one moment arguably did more damage than 10 ordinary mistakes. Tottenham versus Liverpool on September 30th, 2023, when a Luis Diaz goal was wrongly disallowed after a VAR communication error, an incident that became globally symbolic of VAR failure. This is the key point. Even when error totals drop, a single catastrophic incident can dominate the season's perception. Fans don't experience VAR as a spreadsheet, they experience it as trauma moments. In 2024-25, the KMI panel recorded 18 VAR errors, a significant reduction from 31 the year before. So on paper, this is progress, but two things kept the frustration alive. First, the errors that remained were high impact. Even in better seasons, the mistakes that survive tend to be the ones that decide games. Second, the Premier League doubled down on speeding up offside decisions via technology. The league introduced semi-automated offside technology in April 2025, explicitly aiming to improve speed, consistency, and transparency on tight offside calls. This matters because it shows the league recognizing a core truth. When fans don't trust the process, they stop trusting the outcome. From 2019-20 to 2024-25, the Premier League VAR story isn't it got worse every year. The numbers don't support that. What the timeline actually shows is more interesting. The league introduced VAR to prevent the worst injustices. Early seasons were dominated by volume and adjustment pain. 2022-23 exposed a peak in officially logged VAR errors once KMI tracking became central. 2023's 24 improved numerically but suffered iconic breakdowns that shaped perception. 24-25 reduced errors sharply while the league leaned into new offside tech. But trust still didn't fully return, and that sets up the current season perfectly, because even after years of adjustments, new panels, and new technology, the league enters 2025-26 with fewer errors on paper, but less patience in the stadium. Right now, this 2025-26 Premier League season, VAR isn't dominating weekends by how often it intervenes. It's dominating weekends by how often it doesn't. The Premier League's independent key match incidents panel has logged 13 VAR mistakes in the first half of the campaign, a 30% rise on the same stage last season, 10-13. But that headline number hides the real story, because historically, this season should feel calmer. The same point in 2023-24 had 20 errors, and 2022-23 had 23. So why does 2025-26 feel worse? Because the mistakes have shifted from visible chaos to silent damage. Of the 13 errors, 11 are missed interventions, meaning VAR didn't tell the referee to review a decision that the panel later judged should have been changed. Last season at this point, that figure was 7. At the same time, incorrect interventions, VAR getting involved and making it worse, are actually down from 3 to 2. So the public experience isn't VAR ruined the game by interfering. It's VAR watched the game-changing moment and still did nothing. That's why the outrage feels different. A bad intervention creates debate. A missed intervention creates distrust. Even beyond the 13 official errors, the overall intervention volume has dropped. Total overturns have fallen from 57 last season to 47 this season by the halfway stage, a 17.54% drop. When you scan the 13 mistakes logged by the panel, a pattern emerges. These aren't freak one-offs. They repeatedly land in a few categories. Liverpool versus Bournemouth, Marco Senesi's handball sequence was reviewed, but VAR reportedly focused on the initial contact and missed the secondary action that the panel believed should have changed the outcome. Brentford versus Spurs, Christian Romero avoided a red in a situation the panel described as highly likely to lead to control and a run towards goal. These moments reveal a modern VAR problem. Once the on-field decision is framed a certain way, the review can become narrow. Not what happened, but is the referee's interpretation defensible? Wolves versus Man United, a shot shot blocked by an arm position the panel disagreed with, yet no monitor review followed. Chelsea versus Bournemouth. Malo Gusto handball incident later judged differently by the panel than how VAR treated it. Handball is where the public pixel sport feeling comes from because fans expect the most objective answers here, but the league still often treats it as interpretive, dangerous contact, and not enough evidence logic. Chelsea versus Brighton. The panel believed contact was clear enough for VAR intervention on the Gusto Minte incident, but the in-game decision stayed. These incidents inflame anger because they feel like safety decisions, and people don't accept not conclusive when the player is visibly harmed. The mid-season panel breakdown shows clubs aren't experiencing this evenly. Bournemouth, Brentford, and Manchester United have each suffered 2 VAR errors. On the flip side, Chelsea have benefited from 3 errors, the most of any club in the list. Even if you believe this is variance, the fan experience is predictable. Once patterns start to look repeatable, people stop seeing mistakes as random and start seeing them as systemic. Here's the clearest way to frame the season so far. Previous seasons created outrage through volume and delay. This season creates outrage through silence and consequence. Fewer overturns means fewer rescues. More missed interventions means more moments where VAR looks passive. The KMI panel logging mistakes after the fact makes it feel like the league is admitting errors without being able to fix. Damage. That combination is deadly for trust. Acknowledgement without correction. The Premier League has made long-term choices that shape this season's feel. Protect flow. Protect referee authority. Set a high intervention threshold for subjective decisions. That philosophy can work when fans believe the system is consistent. But in 2025-26, the quiet VAR model is backfiring publicly because football's biggest decisions often live in gray areas, and the system is increasingly designed to avoid the gray. VAR was never introduced to make football perfect. It was introduced to stop the moments everyone agreed were wrong. Yet in 2025-26, the Premier League finds itself in an uncomfortable position, a system that recognizes errors, logs them, and discusses them internally, but increasingly allows them to stand on the pitch. The numbers tell us VAR is intervening less. The panel tells us mistakes are still happening, and fans tell us something far more important: trust is slipping. This season hasn't been defined by chaos, endless stoppages, or constant re-refereeing. It's been defined by something quieter: decisions reviewed but untouched, fouls acknowledged but uncorrected, outcomes that feel final long before explanations arrive. Football lives in the moment, VAR lives in procedure, and when those two drift too far apart, every check complete feels less like reassurance and more like dismissal. The Premier League now faces a choice it can't keep avoiding. It can continue to prioritize flow, authority, and restraint, or it can confront the growing gap between how decisions are judged internally and how they are experienced publicly. Because until the league clearly explains what VAR is not allowed to fix, fans will keep blaming it for what it never intervenes in. VAR isn't broken, it's cornered, and until that reality is addressed openly, every silent check will sound exactly the same, like another mistake.